Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome all participants to this workshop today on risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication, which was proposed by Canada in the context of the fifth review of the operation and implementation of the SPS agreement. My name is Greg McDonald. I am the chair of the WTO SPS committee, and it'll be my pleasure to moderate this workshop over the next 2 days. At the outset, I'd like to say I'm very thankful to everyone who has been involved in the organization of this workshop. And in particular, I'd like to thank the WTO Secretariat colleagues who have worked tirelessly to organize this and to make this event possible, and for the interpreters who are working with us today. I would kindly note that interpretation is available in English, French, and Spanish. Interpretation can be accessed by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and choosing your preferred language for this workshop. You have information on how to access the different interpretation channels in the welcome message that should be in the chat. The purpose of the workshop is to bring together officials responsible for the implementation of the SPS agreement, international standard setting bodies, and other international organizations for an in-depth discussion of risk analysis in all its aspects. We will also have speakers from academia, and we'll hear from private sector actors in certain parts of the workshop. We're positively surprised and then, quite frankly, somewhat overwhelmed by the interest that this workshop has generated. The workshop has over 1,000 registered participants, mostly government officials, but also some private sector actors, academia, and NGOs. This is strong evidence for the need for discussions that we'll have in the workshop over the next 2 days. As I mentioned, the workshop will span over 2 days. With today, speakers will discuss issues pertaining to risk assessment and risk management. Speakers will explore the links between risk assessment outcomes and risk management decisions and their experiences, including on capacity building, as well as emerging issues and challenges. Tomorrow will be dedicated to risk communication. Speakers will discuss available guidance and experience in SPS-related risk communication, including on how to communicate the results of risk assessment and its uncertainties, and risk management decisions to stakeholders. In addition, tomorrow afternoon, we'll have speakers presenting case studies on all aspects of risk analysis. The link to the workshop's webpage is now being put in the chat. On this webpage, you will find relevant information on the workshop, including the final program, which has been circulated to WTO members as document Gen/1911/Rev2. On the workshop's webpage, you can also find short biographies of all the speakers we will hear from over the next 2 days. It is not the first time that the WTO hosts an event on risk analysis. This workshop will build on previous WTO events, in particular the 2014 thematic SPS workshop on risk analysis and the 2015 SPS thematic session on risk communication. To support your participation in this workshop, a catalog of useful resources pertaining to risk analysis, including links to these previous WTO events, has been added to the workshop's webpage. The workshop video recordings in English, French, and Spanish, as well as PowerPoint presentations that speakers will use in this workshop, will also be put on the webpage following the event. Throughout the workshop, I encourage you to use the question and answer box to ask questions. To do so, simply open the Q&A box using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, type in your question, indicate the speaker you are addressing the question to, and click send. You all have the possibility to ask questions anonymously. Speakers will then be able to answer your questions orally in the Q&A sessions that are built in throughout the workshop. So this is a WTO workshop, and just to underscore, this is not a meeting of the SPS committee. So you should feel free to raise questions in your personal capacities and not only as representatives of your government. This morning, we will start with a short video clip, followed by a brief overview from the WTO Secretariat on risk analysis in the SPS agreement. We'll then move on to 2 roundtable discussions on the topic of risk assessment. In the first roundtable, representatives from Codex Alimentarius and OIE will discuss international standards relevant to risk assessment. In addition, FAO and OECD will share selected tools to help countries in their risk assessment activities. In the second roundtable, members will share experiences in the area of risk assessment. Each roundtable will be followed by a short Q&A session to answer participants' questions. At 1 p.m. Geneva time, I will close the morning session of this workshop and open 2 side sessions over the lunch break. In these side sessions, you have an opportunity to interact informally and raise follow-up questions with speakers on the topic of risk assessment. One side event will be available to exchange with international organizations that made interventions in the first roundtable, and a second side session to exchange with members that participated in the second roundtable. Discussions in these side sessions will not be moderated, recorded, or interpreted. These sessions will provide an opportunity for informal conversations. All of you should have received earlier today an email with Zoom link to these side sessions. The links are also being put into the chat as I speak. Before I give the floor to our first speaker today, I would like to start with a video clip featuring Robert Griffin and Gretchen Stanton to provide a few introductory remarks on risk assessment and the SPS agreement. Robert Griffin was a National Coordinator for Agriculture Quarantine Inspection and Director of the Plant Epidemiology and Risk Analysis Laboratory with the United States Department of Agriculture. Gretchen Stanton is the former Secretary of the WTO SPS Committee and former Chairperson of the Working Group on SPS measures during the Uruguay Round negotiations. They were both involved in the previous WTO events on risk, in particular, the 2014 WTO workshop on risk analysis. This short video clip will be useful to refresh your memories about some of the discussions on risk analysis in the WTO over the years. I'll now ask my WTO Secretary colleagues to launch the video.
Well, if the world ever needed a reminder of the importance of being able to make decisions and in situations where you don't have complete information on hand, we never have complete information on hand, this last year's pandemic has certainly been that reminder. And it was recognizing that government officials needed to be able to make decisions regarding potential risks from trade in agriculture, potential risks of introduction of exotic plant and animal diseases and pests or food safety risks, that the SPS negotiators wrote provisions regarding risk assessment, risk analysis into the SPS agreement. They started with a very simple marching order from their ministers in the Punta del Este declaration, starting the Uruguay round, which was to minimize the adverse effects of SPS measures on trade and agriculture. But from the very earliest proposals for negotiations, including one from the European Union in 1988, there were suggestions that what had to be done was measures should be adopted to the risks, the actual risks that occurred in actual conditions of production and not the theoretical risks. And from there, as the negotiations in the SPS agreement proceeded, more and more of the negotiators were submitting proposals dealing with the concept of measures based on a risk assessment and minimizing trade restrictive measures according to those risks. So this is sort of the history of why we ended up with these provisions in the agreement. It was a quite early stage of development of risk assessment tools at the international level. It was progressing in the three sister organizations as the SPS negotiations were underway, but it was not at that stage, and I don't believe it still is, really a tool that it's in its full maturity. It's clear that it's a critical element of the SPS agreement. The basis of measures having to be justified by a scientific element, a scientific justification, raised the question of how do you ensure there is a scientific justification? What does that mean? And the answer by the negotiators in the SPS agreement was it meant the measures had to be based on an actual assessment of risks, potential risks that could arise. But this is important, is very clear. At least 166 of the specific trade concerns that have been raised over the years have raised concerns regarding risk assessment. And the question often is twofold. Is there a relevant risk assessment underpinning a measure? And is that measure actually based on the risk assessment? And this is an issue that has been addressed over and over and over again in various formal SPS disputes and complaints we have seen. Almost all have looked at the question of a risk assessment, which in my mind makes it clear that we need to do further work to clarify how this tool can be used and how governments should be using it in making their own decisions. So we looked at this in 2014, but I think it's time to look at it again, revise, and see what's going on and how we can move ahead.
I remember the 2000 workshop, and we were still, in those days, we were still developing, we were still innovating, we were still trying to understand, and there was a lot of effort and a lot of excitement around that. And most of it was devoted to risk assessment, which is interesting to me because the SPS agreement is really about risk management. And it never says risk management anywhere in the agreement, but that is essentially what it's about. Yeah, but all of the effort was really around risk assessment, and that was really the focus at that time. And a lot of methodologies came into place then in the Three Sisters, and I think then when we got to 2014, we started to see that slow down, and people were kind of in the we've got it now, let's just practice it kind of mode, and looking at a few things that were irritants, things like rational relationship, which isn't mentioned at all in the SPS agreement, but seems to come up in every single dispute. So what is this thing, rational relationship, and how does that work? And then dealing with uncertainty, because uncertainty was dealt with by the three organizations in their own way and their own methodologies, but there's nothing really in the SPS agreement except for the discussion of provisional measures, which refers to sufficient scientific evidence. So how we deal with uncertainty in the risk assessment, how we deal with it in risk management, all of that was kind of left in the clouds for people to figure out, and we were still working on that in 2014. And I think still, although I don't think it causes as much tension as it did then, I think that there is we're a little more settled on that issue, but it's still vague and not so well understood. So we've moved, I think, past that development and innovation stage to a point now where it's more about practice, which from my standpoint, I think is unfortunate, because I believe there's still a lot of room for evolution, a lot of room for innovation, a lot of things we can still do, and especially in the area of risk management. And I'm not sure why we've stalled there, but I don't see a lot of work around risk management.
Well, I wish them luck moving ahead this week on the workshop, and do hope that indeed it is this opportunity for exchanging information, learning from each other, sharing ideas, and starting, very importantly, to move ahead and further evolve this use of this extremely important tool.
Yeah, I would add that evolution doesn't mean sophistication, and I think there's sometimes a fear that being more sophisticated is going to make it harder for developing countries and those without the same tools be able to keep up, and that's not the case at all. I think there's plenty of opportunities for innovation, especially in risk management, that are just as easily done by a developing country as a developed country. It really is a very level playing field, I think, in this area, and countries need to take advantage of that, because it's critical to their trade, and trade is critical to their economies. And so this is something that needs to be taken seriously.
Well, I would like to thank both Gretchen and Robert for recording this video and providing their useful insights to kind of kick off our session today. Just one technical note: we did see some comments in the Q&A, and Kemi has responded in the chat. If you are having difficulties in sound quality and you prefer to listen in English while an English speaker is speaking, it would be preferable to turn off your interpretation. You may have better sound quality in that regard. So now, moving on to what the SPS agreement says about risk analysis, risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. I'll now give the floor to Camille Flechet from the WTO Secretariat, who will provide an introductory presentation highlighting the relevant provisions of the SPS agreement dealing with risk analysis. Camille is a dispute settlement lawyer in the WTO. She has experience in the field of investment arbitration and trade disputes, including WTO disputes under the SPS agreement. Kemi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Greg. So in the context of this workshop, we thought it would be useful to go over what the WTO SPS agreement says about risk analysis. And this is not intended to be a comprehensive presentation. The aim is really to give an overview of the main provisions in the SPS agreement that discuss risk analysis. So we know that risk analysis involves risk assessment activities based on hazard identification, followed by risk management, and possibly, if it's deemed necessary, the application of SPS measures. And there's also, of course, risk communication throughout the process. Now, I would like to start by asking all of you a question, and a poll question should be popping up on your screen now. You will have a bit less than 1 minute to answer the question. And the question is, which aspects of risk analysis does the SPS agreement address? A, risk assessment, B, risk management, C, risk communication, and D, all of the above. So please take a moment to choose what you believe is the correct answer to this question. I see that there are quite a few people already casting their vote. So we are closing the poll question now and sharing the results with all of you. So the answer that got picked the most is all of the above. All of the aspects of risk analysis are captured in the SPS agreement. And that is absolutely correct. So the SPS agreement expressly speaks about risk assessment only. However, while the terms risk management and risk communication are not found in the SPS agreement, they are embedded in many of its provisions. Many of the obligations of the SPS agreement are clearly related to managing risk and to risk communication principles. But let us start first with risk assessment. We heard from Gretchen Stanton in the video clip that you just listened to that the requirement that measures be based on scientific justification is at the very heart of the SPS agreement. There are two avenues to comply with this obligation to base SPS measures on science. The first avenue is international standards. Those are the standards of Codex, IPPC, and OIE. And members are strongly encouraged in Article 3 of the SPS agreement to base the SPS measures on those international standards. The second avenue is to base SPS measures on a risk assessment as is foreseen in Article 5.1 of the SPS agreement. And we'll come back to that provision in a moment. But for the moment, I just wanted to draw your attention to Article 5.7 of the SPS agreement, which provides that when relevant scientific evidence is insufficient, members can provisionally adopt SPS measures based on available information without conducting a risk assessment or without basing their measures on relevant international standards. This provision, Article 5.7, embodies the precautionary principle and is critical to dealing with emergency situations in the SPS agreement. But back to Article 5.1. Article 5.1 is really the critical provision dealing with risk assessment in the SPS agreement. Under this provision, members shall ensure that the SPS measures are based on an assessment as appropriate to the circumstances of the risks to human, animal, or plant life or health, taking into account risk assessment techniques developed by relevant international organizations. The language based on, which is highlighted in green on the screen, is really key in this provision. It's not enough that a risk assessment be conducted. The SPS measure has to find ground in that risk assessment. And so here, this really already highlights the link between risk assessment activities and risk management. The language, as appropriate to the circumstances, is also key in this provision. It provides some flexibility to members regarding the type of risk assessment they want to conduct and how it is to be conducted. The SPS agreement also defines what a risk assessment is, and it has two definitions in Annex A4 of the SPS agreement. One for food safety risk and one for pest and disease risk. You have both definitions on the slide. I'm not going to go into very much detail, but I just want to highlight a few important differences between those two definitions. The first definition talks about an evaluation of the potential for adverse effects, while the second one talks about an evaluation of likelihood. So this notion of potential is about a possibility, establishing a possibility, whereas the notion of likelihood is about establishing a probability and is a more onerous requirement. The second important difference is that only the second definition talks about evaluating economic consequences. And on those economic factors, I refer you to Article 5.3 of the SPS agreement for more information. Another important provision in the SPS agreement on risk assessment is Article 5.2. Under Article 5.2, it is said that members shall take into account in all their risk assessment activities, and you have it here on the screen, scientific evidence, processes and production methods, inspection, sampling and testing methods, pest or disease prevalence, ecological and environmental conditions, as well as quarantine and other treatment. What is striking from this list is that scientific evidence has a predominant role to play, but it's only one of the factors to be taken into account. This is also not a closed list, and other elements can certainly be taken into account in risk assessment activities. Now, risk management itself may not be mentioned in the SPS agreement, but it is at the heart of many of its provisions. And the list you have here on the slide is only illustrative. And to give you only a few examples, Article 2.2 of the SPS agreement calls on members to apply SPS measures only to the extent necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health. Under Article 3.3, members are strongly encouraged to base SPS measures on international standards. And jumping further down the list, Article 5.6 requires members to ensure that SPS measures are not more restrictive of trade than required. What this means is that if several SPS options can achieve the desired level of protection, WTO members have to select the least trade restrictive of these options, provided it is technically and economically feasible. So all these provisions on this slide, as well as many others in the SPS agreement, relate to the type of SPS measures that WTO members can decide to adopt. They all discipline risk management in the SPS area. Certain provisions of the SPS agreement also relate to risk communication. These mostly relate to the informative dimension of risk communication principles. that is the exchange of information on risk assessment and risk management between WTO members. The transparency obligations in Article 7 and Annex B of the SPS agreement are particularly relevant in this context. They require notification of draft SPS regulations to allow for comments and exchanges among WTO members before SPS regulations are enacted. They require publication of SPS regulations before they enter into force so that there is time to adjust to new SPS requirements. There's also an obligation for WTO members to set up inquiry points to facilitate the dissemination of information. Inquiry points are responsible for providing information to members, including on risk assessment procedures and factors taken into consideration in risk assessment activities. So clearly, those provisions are highly relevant to risk communication principles. But they're not the only relevant provisions in the SPS agreement. And on the right-hand side of the slide, there's an illustrative list of other relevant provisions. SPS committee decisions and dispute settlement reports have noted that the application of the provisions in this list relies on proper communication among trading partners. And to give you only one example, communication features throughout the committee decision on equivalence within the meaning of Article 4 of the SPS agreement. This committee decision recognizes, and I quote, that transparency, exchange of information, and confidence building by both the importing and exporting member are essential to achieving an agreement on equivalence. And this is really just one example. What is very clear is that all three aspects of risk analysis are embedded more or less directly in the WTO SPS agreement. And this brings me to the end of the presentation. I look very much forward to the discussions over the next 2 days, and I thank you for your attention. Back to you, Greg.
Thank you very much, Kimi, for that presentation. I will turn now to our first roundtable on risk assessment, which will focus on international standards and other international tools. I will invite the moderator and speakers, Ms. Marilyn Hopper, Mr. Tom Highland, Mr. Francisco D'Alessio, Dr. Sophie von Dobschutz, and Dr. Magda Satiana to please turn on their cameras for this roundtable and the Q&A session that follows. Marilyn will be moderating this roundtable. Marilyn Hopper is the Deputy Head of the Secretariat of Standards and Trade Development Facility, the STDF. Marilyn Hopper has extensive experience in international development and trade and leads the STDF knowledge work and public-private partnerships to good regulatory practices in the SPS area. The link to the STDF website is now in the chat in case there's interest. Ms. Hopper, the floor is over to you to moderate this roundtable.
Thank you so much, Greg, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to our speakers for this panel workshop session this morning. It's my pleasure to be here and to moderate the workshop. By way of introduction, I won't say too much on the topic. We've already heard from Gretchen in her introductory video about the importance of risk assessment as part of the SPS agreement and really how critical it is. Camille has taken you through aspects related to this. And I think the objective of this morning's session, and I hope we're going to have a really good and interactive session. I think we are with our lineup of speakers, which is so great. It's really to give an overview of the relevant international standards and guidelines and recommendations and the other tools that exist and that are relevant to risk assessment, as well as to share some information on capacity building opportunities that are out there as well. So, you know, on the panel this morning, we have joining us, I'm looking at the screen and seeing who's here. We have Dr. Sophie von Dobschutz, who's a veterinary epidemiologist at the Animal Health Service of FAO, based at the headquarters in Rome. And so Sophie is working a lot with One Health, with the OIE, with WHO, and on different tools that she is going to be better equipped to tell us about. So that's Sophie who's joining the session this morning. Then we have Dr. Francisco D'Alessio, who's the Deputy Head of the OIE Standards Department and has been with the OIE since 2019. Previously, among his career, also working with SENASA in Argentina as the Director of Epidemiology. I'm going to have my tongue twisting over this word this morning, and risk analysis. We also have Dr. Magda Sashana, who's a policy analyst at the OECD in the Environmental Health and Safety Division in the OECD's Environmental Directorate, and has been working there since 2015, also on diverse aspects related to risk assessment. And last but not least, we have Tom Highland, who many of you will also already know well, who's the Secretary of the Codex Alimentarius Commission of the FAO and WHO. And Tom is based in Rome at the FAO and has been in this position since 2014. So as you know, you've heard already this morning, there's the OIE, the Codex, and of course also the IPPC that are the key standard setting bodies that are referenced in the SPS agreement. You may be wondering that the IPPC is not part of the panel discussion, but you will have a chance to hear more about the IPPC's work on this topic in the next session, which is talking about members' experiences with Alison Neely talking about the IPPC's work on risk assessment. So before we get started, I think the WTO colleagues are going to put a little poll on the screen for you with a quick question. I think that's going to appear any moment. And the question is, you'll have 45 seconds to answer this question. And the question is, do you use international guidance on risk assessment as part of your work? We have a lot of participants in this workshop this morning, and I'm sure that many of you do. So let's see what participants in this session respond on this question. Do you use international guidance on risk assessment? Yes, no, or don't know. Really to just take stock of who's in the room, I think. Colleagues in the SPS organization unit for this in the SPS team will probably put the answer to the question on screen in a moment. And then we'll move right into the session with speakers. And I think we'll have a lot of opportunity to hear more about all of these tools that exist this morning. It's really to share information and to discuss and exchange on the existing tools. And you will hear there are many different tools now. So yes, overwhelmingly, yes, you know, more than 80% of respondents to this poll survey are using international guidance on the use of risk assessment. So I think it'll be interesting to see through the Q&A, you know, to what extent you're using some of the tools that will be presented to you this morning as well. So I would also like to remind participants in the session to please use the Q&A to submit your questions, your comments. We have quite a lot to cover in the session this morning, and we need to end the session just before 11:45. So I'm going to ask a number of questions to our panelists, and you will have a chance as participants to engage through the Q&A, to submit your comments, to submit your questions, and we will try our best to get through as many of those as possible in the Q&A session at the end of the session. I'd also like to remind you that there is an informal discussion, online discussion planned from 1 to 2 o'clock today. So in case we don't get a chance to get through all your questions by 11:45 this morning, you can come back to that informal session between 1 and 2, very informal, and you will have a chance to take the floor and to exchange with the speakers who will be part of that session. And that will really provide a nice complement to this this morning's session. So yeah, we've had the brief introductions. The full bios for our speakers is, of course, on the website, as you've heard. So welcome to our panelists this morning. So Tom, I'd like to start out with you and to ask you if you could please tell us about the guidance that's offered by Codex to help countries to conduct their own risk assessment. So over to you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Marlin, and it's good to see that there's so many people interested in this workshop. It's as many as for the Codex Commission that we had last year. That's very good. And when thinking about risk assessment and Codex, maybe many people first think about the fact that Codex is a recipient of the risk assessment that is done for Codex by independent expert bodies that are organized by FAO and WHO. So that is the first part. And actually, one should say that one of these risk assessment scientific bodies predates Codex. That's the JACFA, the committee that is dealing with the additives and contaminants and veterinary drugs. Actually, is a couple of years older than Codex even. Codex always used risk assessment since it was formed in 1963. But I think, as Gretchen pointed out, when the SPS committee, the SPS agreement entered into force, this all became a little bit more systematic. So Codex first started working on definitions and also on statements of principle of how should risk assessment be used in Codex. That dates from 1997. And there's already the same language, similar language to the SPS agreement. Health and safety aspects of Codex decisions and recommendations should be based on risk assessment as appropriate to the circumstances. Should be soundly based on science, and there should be a functional separation of risk assessment and risk management. Now, following that, Codex developed the definitions, the general guidance for how do we use risk assessment, how do we use risk analysis, as we say, as we call the three things together, right? Risk assessment, management, and communication. How do we use that in Codex? And following that, until about 2010, all the different food safety committees developed their own guidance on how in their specific fields, like in pesticide residues, veterinary drugs, food additives, contaminants, and so on, how they would use risk analysis in their work. Now, all this, and usually if I had the book with me, which I don't have, I would wave the procedure manual at you. All this was included in our procedure manual, which was suddenly after risk analysis entered was 1/3 bigger than before. So 1/3 of our procedure manual is that, and that contains very useful guidance. What is maybe a little bit less known, or I hope it is known, but I suspect maybe it's a little bit less known, that there's also text where Codex directly gives guidance to governments, to countries on how to assess the risk. There's general guidance on risk analysis, then on specific topics. I name a few on microbiological risk assessment, how to analyze the risk of foods derived from modern biotechnology, risk analysis for antimicrobial resistance, and a couple of others where it was decided in Codex not to develop any prescriptive standards or codes of practice, or first actually develop the risk analysis area and then later get also to more stringent guidance for members. So there's quite a lot of material available in Codex. Hopefully we have some time to talk more about that. I will stop here for the introduction, Molly. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Tom. Yeah, very good introduction, because I think that's it. There is so much available. So I think also, there is really a lot available, and that's where I think keep an eye on the chat, because WTO SPS colleagues have posted a link there, I think, to the catalog of resources. So within that, you can find links to all of this different guidance. And we'll be hearing more about some of the guidance that's mentioned in that catalog as we move through the session. So let me pass now to you, Francisco, from the OIE. If you could maybe tell us about the types of OIE standards that exist on risk assessment, please.
Yeah, thank you, Marlene. So the OIE does have specific standards on import risk analysis. And in both of the terrestrial and the aquatic code, there are the main sets of standards related to international trade. There is a dedicated chapter to import risk analysis, and they are both aligned, and they provide the principles and recommendations for conducting transparent, objective, and defensible import risk analysis for international trade. They are quite simple standards. They don't go into the detail, but they do define the main principles and establish some definitions for the 4 components of risk analysis. So, meaning hazard identification, risk assessment, risk management, and risk communications. They do not prescribe a single method, but they do define the approach and the main principle for that. And they even are clear, opening the possibility for members to choose different ways, either qualitative or quantitative approaches to risk assessment. And it also makes they also make the connection with the relevant other standards at the OIE. Based on that, on those specific chapters of the codes, the OIE has developed some more specific guidelines that it's mainly, or the main one, the most known one, it's an OIE handbook on import risk analysis for animal and animal products. That is more of a detailed practical guideline, providing more insight and methodologies for undertaking this both qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. It's a 2-volume publication. I think it's been shared and it's part of the resources of this workshop. The first part is more the introduction and the qualitative one, and the second volume it's on quantitative, so techniques for conducting quantitative risk assessments. Then there's other guidance on, for example, on risk analysis for invasive species. So it's not related to diseases, but it's more related to the invasiveness of some animal species. And then there are some other OIE standards that fit into this project, but I would be happy to talk about that later, because we will have time, I think, during the full workshop to visit all the relevant aspects of the process. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Francisco. So yeah, definitely, I mean, OIE has a lot of resources and tools, and I think that's it. There's no single method, and it can differ also across the different standard setting bodies, the approach and the types of materials. And I did mention also that IPPC is not part of this session, but of course they have a lot of guidance and resources on pest risk assessment, and you will be hearing more about that as part of the next session too. So let's move to you now, Sophie. Sophie, I know you're working in FAO and you're working very closely with OIE in many areas related to animal health and risk assessment. So could you tell us a little bit about the other kinds of tools that FAO has available on risk assessment?
Yes, thank you so much for this question. Indeed, in addition to the standards that are made available from the OIE, FAO usually produces topic-specific risk assessment guidance. And I've added actually many examples to the catalog of resources that you are providing to participants. So participants are welcome to have a look. For animal health risk assessment, FAO bases its guidance obviously on the OIE risk analysis framework that Francisco mentioned just now. Generally, OIE lays down the standards, and FAO then assists countries in reaching those standards by providing fit-for-purpose guidance. And our guidance is often either disease-specific or topic-specific. So, for example, we have guidance on a value chain approach to animal disease risk management, or on risk communication in animal disease outbreaks or emergencies, or on rapid risk assessment for animal health threats, just to name a few really. What we are also producing is specific risk assessments on certain disease situations. For example, when we had the recent spread of lumpy skin disease into the Asia region, we would assess this and provide early warning to countries. or in 2013 when H7N9 emerged in China, we were conducting a risk assessment. And of course, last year, when COVID-19 pandemic emerged and there was a suspicion of an animal source, we were quick to come in and look at all the available information in order to come up with an exposure assessment for humans or animals to susceptible animals to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Apart from the animal health issues that I now mentioned, because as you said, I'm working for the Animal Health Service, so this is obviously my area. As Tom already pointed out, FAO also addresses AMR or microbiological risk assessment, and there was a recent guidance provided even this year focusing on food. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So yeah, clearly FAO, and you've been working with a lot of different tools, and interesting too to hear about, you know, COVID-19 and how this relates to the topic of the session this morning too. Francisco, I'd like to move back to you now, because you told us about the OIE specific standard on risk assessment, but are there other OIE standards that are relevant to the topic as well? Could you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Yes, thank you, Marilyn. Indeed, in addition to the specific standards on import risk analysis that I just mentioned, the OIE standards are really structured in a way to enable this to be used in a concrete manner. So when we think about the risk analysis process, it's a tool that uses data, information, and an expert opinion. So the OIE standards also feed into the risk analysis process to play a critical role in trying to provide standardization to critical points, facilitating transparency, and also easing the understanding between different countries discussing. So for example, when you look at the different components of risk assessment that we're talking this morning, we normally start by hazard identification. So for the OIE standards, we do have a list of diseases. That list of diseases is a constitutive part of the terrestrial code and the aquatic code. It is a chapter. There is an SOP to conduct and identify which diseases should go through the process of assessing. There are defined criteria that are defined in the standards. Once a change in this list is proposed, it is discussed and circulated to members who can comment, review, and then the list is finally adopted by the assembly. And the idea is that this list is the list that should be the basis for discussions for measures in a general manner. Then also a key obligation of OIE members is to notify the disease situation, not only changes for the listed diseases, but also on emerging diseases, and also there are periodic reports obligations. So this information that is shared by members is critical to give the information that it's the first step of the hazard identification step. Then in terms of aquatic animals, there's also a set of criteria and a specific discussion on how to define susceptible species for the different diseases. And in both codes, we do have also a set of defined criteria and process to define for each disease a set of commodities that are safe per se and are listed because they should imply no measure for trade. Then, if we look at the second step, for example, for risk assessment or even the entry assessment, there are specific standards on animal health surveillance, specific standards on how to define the animal health status of a country, a zone, of a region, specific standards on regionalizations, either for zoning or compartmentalization. And there's a full section in 2 codes providing general measures for disease control and prevention. And these set of standards are both thought to be used by members assessing the risk of a disease being present in a country or being present in a zone to be a risk for import. but also by exporting countries to base their measures on and to support their freedom or their measures that are implemented. And then there's a whole section that deals with the quality of veterinary services. It's a key part of the assessment of the health situation of a country and the potential effectiveness of the sanitary measures. So the idea is that all this set of standards works together as a system to try to provide not only the general recommendations on the import risk assessment, but the different standardization of the different components to facilitate members assessing the risk, and then further on, and we will talk later today, in establishing and making the risk management decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. Yeah, so it's all working together as part of the system. And you talked about members commenting on changes to their disease status. So I'm sure there are many participants in the room who are involved in that, maybe directly, or who have colleagues that they know who are making those notifications also when things change at the country level and that are so critical for trade. So, let's move now to Sophie. You mentioned, of course, the collaboration that FAO has with the OIE, but I know that FAO and OIE are also working very closely with the WHO as part of the One Health initiative to ensure this holistic collaborative approach to the management and control of zoonotic diseases. So could you tell us a bit more about this collaboration, including the new FAO, OIE, WHO joint risk assessment operational tool that was published just very recently? Over to you, Sophie.
Yes, thank you. So obviously, let's say thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, One Health has become an in-word right now. That's a new trend that's being used widely, but actually the tripartite collaboration on One Health has been very successful for over 2 decades now. And when I joined FAO in 2004, we were just setting up the global early warning system on transboundary animal diseases, including zoonoses, with WHO and OIE. Another milestone was probably the 2010 tripartite concept note, where the 3 organizations described their collaboration and objectives in the prevention and control of health risks at the animal-human ecosystems interface. And then, of course, very importantly, in 2019, the Tripartite Zoonosis Guide, or TZG in short, was published by the Tripartite, and this is providing guidance and support to countries in operationalizing and mainstreaming One Health approaches at national or even subnational levels. And particularly, I was part of the team developing the Joint Risk Assessment, or JRA, operational tool, which was the very first operational tool to be published under the TZG last December in 2020. And JRA provides a methodology to countries for assessing shared health risks at the animal-human environment interface, jointly with the involvement of all contributing sectors, such as animal health, public health, and environment, or wildlife health. And by bringing together expertise and data from all these sectors, the risk assessment then becomes more complete. And saying that, we do not recommend the JRA to replace sector-specific assessments, of course. It should rather be used in addition. Sector-specific assessments remain essential and have evolved over the years to address the questions and needs of individual sectors, so we will always rely on them. However, experience has shown that if one sector assesses a health risk at the interface in isolation, the assessment is usually not comprehensive, because they're missing important information from the other sectors to have a really complete picture of the situation. We suggest, therefore, that the information generated during sector-specific assessments is brought to the table for the joint risk assessment, where it can be shared and discussed with the other sectors. Once the risk questions in the JRA have been formulated and assessed, the tool then also provides guidance on recommending evidence-based risk mitigation measures. So using the outcomes of the assessment to decide on relevant and appropriate mitigation measures, and also risk communication messages to make the the picture complete in the risk analysis process. And again, when we have the sectors doing this jointly, we also make sure that all sectors agree on these measures and messages and collaborate in their implementation. And in addition to this more technical guidance, how to do an assessment and how to come up with these recommendations for risk mitigation and communication, the JRA tool also has an introductory section on how to set up and institutionalize joint risk assessment within national structures. And of course, we don't want to reinvent the wheel here at all. I mean, we really suggest JRA is incorporated into existing national One Health coordination mechanisms, usually called One Health platforms. And this is an important step also in setting up the JRA to agree who would form the steering committee, who would form the technical team, and what would be triggers for iterations of a joint risk assessment, because obviously as any risk assessment, it's important to repeat the JRA on specific health threats from time to time whenever additional information is becoming available, or the epidemiological situation changes, or I don't know if we're talking about viruses, the virus evolves genetically and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, very interesting, I think. So it's definitely something that's complementing the sector-specific assessments, as you said, but looking at, you know, the intersections and the relationships and the interconnections across those different areas, and also with the environment. And I think definitely you're at FAO, so the Food Systems Summit and taking that more holistic, collaborative approach is definitely something that I think a lot of people are thinking about right now. You mentioned, Sophie, you know, the linkage with the environment, and I think I understand that there are plans for UNEP to come into this joint risk assessment operational tool, or the collaboration. Do you want to add a little bit on that, please?
Yes, sure, with pleasure. So indeed, this year UNEP is joining the tripartite as a fourth member with currently developing a so-called tripartite plus agreement. And obviously they've been asked to join to strengthen the ecosystem's contribution. And again, you know, with the current COVID-19 pandemic and this presumed origin from animals and most likely wildlife, it has become evident that the ecosystem's contribution in One Health approaches really needs to be ensured and unfortunately strengthened. We've been neglecting this a tiny bit in the past. So now we're going full steam to make sure this is included. And so the tripartite plus UNEP are now working on a global plan of action on One Health to provide global governance and ensure coordinated interventions, and a supporting funding mechanism that will go with it. And we are also partners in other international One Health commitments. So for example, the One Health working groups by the G7 and G20 with the related activities, working on a knowledge hub and working on a call for action on One Health, etc. We have also recently set up, that might be interesting for you as well to know, as we're talking about evidence-based decisions. So we have set up a One Health high-level expert panel, OLEP in short. And that includes experts on One Health issues from all around the globe. And they have been tasked to advise the Tripartite Plus and ensure our approaches and the kind of recommendations we make and develop are really evidence-based. Yeah, and this increased trend towards more cross-sectional collaboration is going on even inside our respective organizations, I would say. So because I come from FAO, I give you the example of FAO. We have dedicated one of our priority areas under our new strategic framework, 10-year strategic framework that is kicking off next year. We have dedicated one of the priority areas entirely to One Health, and also set up a new center which is specifically focusing on zoonotic diseases, AMR, and One Health concepts. And I'm pretty sure similar evolvements are going on in the other organizations as well.
Thank you, Sophie. I think that takes us perfectly to the next question I wanted to ask, which is to Magda, because I know that you're all working closely with the OECD as well in this, and OECD is also has a number of tools and resources to support the use of risk assessment in areas that are relevant for SPS measures. So Magda, over to you to give us a quick tour of the different OECD resources that are available, please.
Yes, thank you, Marlene. Indeed, throughout the years, the OECD has developed a number of tools and resources to support the use of risk assessment in areas relevant to SPS measures. But maybe before moving ahead and start listing our various tools for risk assessment, it would be worth mentioning that with the exception of OECD legal instruments, for example, the Council decisions, there is no legal status to an OECD standard unless this is explicitly referenced in a Council Act. A recent relevant example of a Council Act that is relevant to us is the recommendation of the Council on countering the illegal trade of pesticides. So all other OECD standards are guidance that governments can use or not as they deem necessary. So they're not mandatory. But we see a significant uptake of OECD standards, and in particular of the test guidelines, which are a unique tool for assessing the potential effects of chemicals on both human health and the environment. So these test guidelines are accepted internationally as standard methods for safety testing. So they can go through a big range of chemicals, including pesticides. And there is a specific section for these test guidelines that are dedicated to pesticide residues. So, for example, I'll give you a recent revision that we made on a test guidelines for crop field trials. This is a test guideline that is used to not only for conducting dietary risk assessment, but also for deriving maximum residues limits, the very popular MRLs. So almost all the test guidelines that we have are accompanied by guidance documents. So through these guidance documents, we tend to provide some more technical information on how to conduct these studies, but also on how to interpret data. Of course, with respect to the calculation of MRLs and their harmonization across the OECD countries, we developed the OECD MRL calculator. So this tool is supported from a user guide and also from a statistical white paper. Of course, under the auspices of OECD, we have developed more guidance documents and also electronic tools that are developed to support chemical testing and assessment. It is worth mentioning a project that we have on the case studies. These are the integrated approaches to testing and assessment of case study project, where basically what we are trying to do is to provide a forum for scientific exchange on of approaches of how novel methods can be used and identify best practices. And because I've heard a lot about the uncertainty that plays a big role, this is something that is targeted through this effort as well. And we are looking into developing potentially in the future some guidance. With respect to the electronic tools, I will mention a few relevant to the pesticides, such as the globally harmonized submission and transport standard, the pesticide risk indicators, and also there are a number of other tools like the QSAR toolbox, that's an in silico methods that are used for quantitative structure activity relationship, the AOP wiki, the adverse outcome pathway wiki, the ECM portal, Euclid, and the OECD harmonized templates. But hopefully in my following up interventions, I will try to elaborate more on these tools.
Thank you, Magda. I see that you also have, a lot of guidance and tools and different documents and resources that can be of help. So I'm beginning to see why this catalog of resources document is so important, because it puts everything together in one place with the links, because there's really a lot of guidance and materials and resources and tools that exist. So I'm sure the participants will find that catalog of resources document very, very useful. So Tom, back to you. Magda and some of the other speakers, it was the earlier speakers, talked about some of the emerging trends or changes or developments in this area and how this is affecting, the types of resources and tools that are available, including with regard to One Health. So Tom, what kind of changes or trends do you see emerging that are likely to be important for risk assessment in the future that participants maybe should be aware of?
Thanks very much. Well, first of all, I think Gretchen mentioned it already, that while risk assessment has been now properly introduced into all the standard setting, there will be developments in the future, but before we come to developments in the future, there are sometimes still misunderstandings about what we have, about the different, let's say, the different phases of the risk assessment. We sometimes still have panicky discussions in the news when only a partial risk assessment has been done, when maybe only the hazard has been identified and characterized, but not really estimated how much risk does this actually lead, and also to get Codex members sometimes to accept the risk assessment that has been made, because there are situations where let's say economic considerations may lead to not accepting risk assessment. So I think before looking, also obviously there will be new ways, and we will have to find new ways also, because one great preoccupation that we have at the moment is the speed of the risk assessment that we have. And we notice that while we can fairly well transform Codex meetings to virtual, for the risk assessors who really rely on a number of highly qualified experts getting together and working. I mean, when you see these guys working, when they come to Rome or to Geneva, they work like 12 hours per day. And when you have them, each of them in their countries, it's just not feasible to do it the same way. So actually at the moment, maybe I'm more preoccupied with, on the one hand, the application of risk assessment that have been made, and the proper continuation of the risk assessment under the present conditions. And we're getting lots of calls from members and also from industry about the concerns with the delays that we're facing with the risk assessment at the moment. Over.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, no, definitely a lot of challenges related to the environment that we're all in and the need to progress with this work. And it's definitely not easy and challenging. I'm seeing.
Sorry if I interrupt you. One thing I forgot. There's also like JEXPA right at this moment trying to consider exposure from multiple sources, which is more of a newer thing. And we also have a joint CCPR and CCRVDF, so the pesticide residues and the residues of veterinary drugs working group, so working together on aspects that consider both areas of risk. So just wanted to add that as that's maybe a small innovation that is happening there as well.
Okay.
Over to you.
No, that's
Sorry.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, and it reflects the collaborative aspect of all of this too. Magda, have you observed new trends or changes that are affecting your work in the area of risk assessment?
Yes, thank you, Marlene. The main trend that is observed lately is the integration of multiple information from multiple sources, I meant. So before we were relying only on one source, and that was traditionally the animal methods that were used. Where now we're moving away from that, and we use multiple sources, for example, in vitro or tests, or in silico or methods, and we combine them. We bring them all together. So nowadays we're talking about these NAMs, the new approach methodologies that include cell culture methods, these QSAR, as I've said, models or chemoinformatics. We have also grouping of chemicals and read-across. And these seem to gain momentum at the moment in risk assessment. So these information sources, they can either be integrated through a flexible approach, so by using a weight of evidence analysis, or we can use fixed data interpretation procedure, so we can have a defined approach. And I'm happy to announce that last month we had our first defined approach that has been published at a level of a standard as a test guideline. So that's a kind of shift that we see, and to illustrate this relevance of NAMs and the impact that can have to SPS relevant measures, is enough to bring this example of the current update that we are doing on the guidance and definition of residue, that regulatory authorities, but also GMP are using to choose which residues will be used for dietary risk assessment, but also for setting and enforcing MRLs. So the revised guidance includes more emphasis on the toxicological assessment of metabolites, and incorporates these new tools, these new methodologies. So we'll see there the chemoinformatics, the grouping of metabolites based on their chemical structure, on physicochemical properties or biological activities. And also we are using the reasonably new concept on threshold of toxicological concern. Also, something else that I would note that we'll see as a trend is this increase in the use of the OECD harmonized templates, in particularly in the field of pesticides. That was a tool that was used for industrial chemicals, but not so much for pesticides. So now they're using these templates for reporting data, and also storing that in suitable databases like the Euclid database.
Thank you, Magda. So while I'm listening to you and also the other speakers, I'm also, realizing that it's quite challenging to use some of these tools and to carry out the risk assessments. And it's also resource intensive in terms of the time that's required, also financial aspects, and also the scientific knowledge and skills and expertise that's required. So I'm imagining that, we have participants in this session also coming from developing countries, maybe least developed countries. So just before we get to the Q&A session with participants, and I have seen several participants are posting questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom meeting, so we are going to get to those questions. Before we do, I'd just like to ask each of our speakers, maybe briefly, in a couple of minutes, 2 minutes each, to tell us about the types of capacity development support or assistance that is available through their organizations to help some of the developing countries that may require support or assistance to be able to make use of some of these tools and to use risk assessment in the way it's intended under the SPS agreement. So over to you, Francisco, first. If you could, give us an intro or a quick overview to what's available through the OIE, please.
Yeah, thank you, Marlene. So the OIE has implemented over the years a lot of seminars, workshops specific to risk assessment, specific to the use of international standards or OIE standards in the context of trade or international trade. We normally or frequently include import risk assessment or import risk analysis in thematic sessions with, for example, for foot and mouth disease or African swine fever, which are relevant or critical concerns for international trade. But there's also an important aspect that import risk analysis, it's a process that is, let's say, conducted by the importing country, but also needs a lot of input from the exporting country. And at the end of the day, it also has an impact on the exporting country, who is the one who should implement the sanitary measures or develop the national assurance systems to support those measures. So there is also many of the OIE missions that, as I said before, has to do with the implementation of the other standards that relate, for example, to disease notification or official or status recognition, and the OIE has specific programs directed to that and a lot of capacity building for that. For example, for notification of diseases, there is a dedicated system. We can talk about it later. There is a dedicated capacity building program to train the national focal points to provide good and information. There's also a full program for a set of 6 diseases to develop official status recognition for diseases. And there's also a capacity building program to support countries understanding the process, developing their dossiers, and achieving that official recognition. There is also another program for the other diseases for countries to self-declare free from diseases. So there's also capacity building on that to implement that. There is an OIE network of reference laboratories and collaborating centers that are expertise center all over the world with a regional balance across the globe that are available to provide countries with their support, either on specific diseases for the reference laboratories or in horizontal topics. And there are specialized centers on risk analysis or risk assessment that are there to part of their mission is to support members. They can receive queries and sometimes they come through us and we channel them, but they can also be reached directly. And then there is also the scientific publications provided by the OIE, who are also there to support members achieving this information. And at the end of the day, it's also building the capacity to conduct risk assessment, but also trying to promote transparency and consistency across the process, because we believe that that is critical, not only to have the good risk assessment, but to have the good information and to build trust and confidence all along the process to finally achieve measures that are both safe and fair and achievable by both importing and exporting members. Over to you.
Thank you, Francisco. Yeah, so it's great to hear about all that, types of support that's available as well. And I think also we need to be looking at, the bigger picture of support. So risk assessment capacity is really, underpinned by everything else that needs to be in place too. So Tom, over to you quickly, if you could, tell us about the types of guidance or support that's available for the implementation of the food safety risk assessment, please.
Thanks very much, Marlene. Well, you may know Codex is organized a little bit differently to OIE and IPPC. We do not, as such, in the Secretariat have a capacity building branch. However, one can argue that even the cooperation of the delegations in Codex builds a certain amount of capacity when they come to the different Codex meetings and apply actually risk assessments and risk management there. In addition, we used to have workshops together with our regional committees, a bit like this one that we're having today, focusing on specific topics that might be of interest to the different regions. The risk assessment bodies of FAO and WTO can actually also work on demand of countries. They don't only reply to Codex requests, but they can also request work on country requests. Then more directly, there can be technical cooperation projects with FAO. This is how this is usually happening. For example, we had a SCDF, well, you might be familiar with that, the SDF Total Diet Studies in West Africa implemented by FAO. And we have recent publications on evidence-based risk management, stressing the importance of risk ranking, also to give countries more pragmatic guidance on how to base their risk management on evidence. So there's a lot happening. Certainly, it's still not enough, but we're trying to do our best. Thanks.
Great, and I think it's also that you mentioned it's based on demand. So countries that would like to have support or assistance in these different areas need to raise the hands and come forward and find a way to access some of the support that's available to, whether it's through FAO's technical cooperation project or an STDF project or something else. And I do remember the Total Diet Study project in West Africa, which was on chemical contaminants. And really the evidence base that is often very missing too in developing countries. So there is, a lot more that needs to be done there. But Sophie, over to you on this joint risk assessment operational tool. If you could quickly, tell us about the types of support that might be available to implement that on the ground.
Yeah, thank you. And as you said, so I will focus on the joint risk assessment tool, the kind of support we provide, and not go into details on FAO specific support on animal health risk assessment, which is also there, but if we have time later, I can maybe add a few sentences later. We've made a huge effort assisting countries in the first time use of the JRA. And me and my tripartite colleagues have been supporting national workshops very closely, provided in-person facilitation when this was still possible. Obviously now it has to be done remotely. We're now, however, trying to slowly reduce this effort. First of all, we can't really keep it up with all the requests we receive from countries. And second, we also place part of our effort in providing online training for JRA and very detailed facilitation materials instead. And so we really would like to get this going and have countries using these materials instead of relying on our in-person support. We developed a very successful formula for national JRA workshops, and they will last about 3 days. Countries get a draft agenda to look at, and they will adapt this agenda according to their priorities. And we usually suggest to precede this workshop by a one-day facilitator training, where really national facilitators are being familiarized with the tool, trained up, and they're immediately supporting their national workshops then. So they will facilitate the risk assessment exercise that is usually happening on day 2, where a full-blown technical risk assessment will be completed, and we often split participants, because there are many, into different groups to do so, and they each focus on one health threat. And each of these groups are obviously representing, we're making sure there are representatives from the different sectors in each of the groups. And so the outcomes from such an exercise are already valid and interesting for the country. And usually us international facilitators, we will remain in the background and only step in if asked, if there are any questions or complications. And for the facilitation materials that we develop, so they include a checklist for the preparation of these national workshops, a number of templates, including for the risk framing, which is one of the important steps that is actually guiding the joint risk assessment and should be done in advance of such a workshop. Presentation templates that countries can use and adapt. We also recorded these presentations, so national facilitators can listen to the recordings and then adapt their presentations accordingly. And all this is available on a Trello board and readily shared with countries that are interested in using the JRA. And we also paid from the beginning very particular attention to writing the tool in a way so that it can be understood by everyone and used even by people with no prior risk assessment experience. Obviously, it's always added value if someone is already familiar with the concept, because the JRA follows the same concept as all the other sector-specific or topic-specific risk assessments, but it's not directly necessary. And we propose a qualitative approach for the JRA so it can incorporate expert opinion where there is data lacking, and that's why JRA can also be used in emergency situations or in the context of emerging diseases where there usually is very little information available first, and then slowly we're getting a better grip on the situation and collecting information on the way. But JRA can really be used with very little information at hand.
Okay, great. Thanks. I think it's a great approach. You know, countries are in the driving seat. It's learning by doing and developing capacity through the people really doing it, and you more as a coaching, facilitating, making it all available. So yeah, I think for sustainability, that really bodes well for the future. So Magda, over to you on the OECD side. If you could very quickly in a minute or two, tell us, or 2 minutes, if there are, efforts or programs that might be available on the OECD side to help apply some of the tools you spoke about earlier. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marlene. Indeed, a very popular program that we have in the OECD is the program on mutual acceptance of data. That allows OECD member countries as well as countries that adhere to this program to share data, but this data needs to be generated following the OECD test guidelines. And they should be contacted under a good laboratory practice environment. So the data generated in one OECD country can be used in the risk assessment conducted by another country. And this program really saves lots of money, lots of resources for countries, but also for industry. OECD also develops tools to help facilitate data sharing. I've mentioned already the OECD harmonized templates for chemical safety data, our Euclid database, and something that I didn't have to elaborate the opportunity to earlier is our ECAM portal. The ECAM portal actually allows searching of reports and data sets by chemical name or identifier. And also it provides direct links to the GHS classification, along with links to hazard and risk information. That means that somebody, by entering a chemical name, can find the hazard assessment and risk information in another country. And this is a tool that is very widely used. Of course, we're hosting webinars to train people or on our new tools as they're coming along. For example, we had a very successful webinar on PBK modeling. This is physiological-based kinetic modeling and how to extrapolate data, exposure data that can be used in risk assessment. One last thing that I would like to mention are the global joint reviews. They had bigger momentum in the past, but as we've heard in our last working party on pesticides meeting, there will be an effort to emphasize our work more to this direction, and in particular how to use these global joint reviews for minor uses. These are for pesticides that can be used for minor crops or pests. And of course, training activities that we're conducting, and maybe to address also some question that I see, we had recently a webinar, a training activity organized jointly with the WHO that was on illegal trade of pesticides, and there are more joint efforts that we're planning to organize together, like a conference on biopesticides.
Thank you, Magda. So it's great that you are having a look at the questions in the Q&A box too. So hopefully we'll have time to get through a few of those questions now, and I'm sure we'll be keeping those questions for the session that will start at 1 o'clock in a couple of hours. So if any of the participants want to speak directly to any of the panelists about some of the issues or challenges that you're facing, or you just like to have that exchange, please come back at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to pick out some of these questions that have come in. So maybe I'll read out 3 questions, and then I'll leave it to the speakers, to the panelists, to come in on those. So one question that has come in the Q&A is about the difficulty for risk assessors when there's really limited information available in the country on the risk and the difficulties of doing risk assessment. So that's one question. There was another question that was interesting about, we're talking a lot about the science and the scientific needs, but to run these risk assessments, you also need database systems and IT systems and expertise. So someone was asking about that. And then someone was asking, another question that came in was related to risk assessments for endocrine disruptors. And then there were a couple of questions there, longish ones, Tom, that were addressed at you. So maybe you could just read those in the chat and then restate the question when you answer it. So those are 4 questions. We have limited time. So would each of you like to address, something that you have seen related to those questions or a question in the chat? Maybe Sophie, I'll start with you. I see your hand up.
Yes, and I can, or I would like to answer the first one, which is a really, really important question. And we're actually facing these kind of situations very often. We face them with newly emerging diseases where we yet have to understand even the pathogen and how it behaves. We've seen that last year with SARS-CoV-2. We've seen that in 2013 with the H7N9 avian influenza. We've seen it with MERS coronavirus in 2012. And so the tips I would like to give, first of all, so if it's an emerging disease and we don't yet really know the pathogen, you can use similar pathogens to try and understand and predict how this pathogen might behave. Of course, you can't be 100% sure because you need time to observe and to confirm that this is really the case. But often, in situations where diseases are emerging, they're causing problems, either animal health-related problems, trade-related problems, or public health-related problems. Risk managers want an answer from you right now, and you don't have the information. So try and look at similar pathogens. Another situation where we find ourselves with little information at hand is, for example, a threat of introduction or a new introduction of a pathogen in a country. So as you rightly said in your question, then you face a situation where the country actually has no information yet on the pathogen and how it would move in this country. So here you can look at information you have available on the pathogen and how it behaves in other countries to try and understand and predict how it would move in your country. And you might already, and this ideally you do in peacetime, if it's an animal pathogen, you look at your value chains, you look at your production systems, you try to have a good understanding where you find your different animal populations in your country. And so that at the moment you have this threat and this pathogen is, I don't know, a small ruminant pathogen, already where your small ruminant population is and the value chains related to that, and where you have to focus, for example, risk-based surveillance, where you have to focus intervention measures and so on.
Great. Thank you, Sophie. I'm jumping in because I'm looking at the clock and we have 4 minutes left. So Tom, let me just give you the floor if you could answer maybe in a minute, and then I see Francisco has his hand up too. Sorry for giving you.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, there was a question from Hakim, one of our coordinators. Question is about, well, how to make sure that countries actually apply Codex standards, how to help countries implement Codex standards, such as more complex ones, such as the working principles for risk analysis for food safety. There again, what we're doing at the moment in the framework of the strategic plan is we're looking at what is the situation at the moment. What do we actually understand as application? Because different texts have different form of application. Standard is more stricter, and the code of practice is something which you integrate differently in your working procedures in the country. So then to identify what is lacking in that kind of application and how can we get this done. And we're also looking especially forward to working with the coordinators in order to do that in the future. I don't know if I have the time for the other question, which was interesting. It was the question of if one WTO member has done a risk assessment and due to that applies stricter measures, why can't Codex not just review its own risk assessment and then apply that? That might lead to less trade concerns in WTO. Well, it might lead to less trade concerns in WTO from those countries who support that kind of risk assessment, but other countries may support the risk assessment that was done by the Codex international body. So in that point, as we are doing the international standard, the country would be okay, right? Because the country has done its risk assessment, it's basing its own standard on risk assessment. So for WTO purposes, would be okay. But in case of Codex, we have other considerations. We have to take other countries into account and our own risk assessment, first of all. So I stop here to give Francesco some time to speak.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. Later. Thank you. Over to you, Francisco, and thanks for all these interesting questions, I think, from the participants too. Over to you, Francisco.
Yeah, thank you, Marilyn. Yeah, and look, I'm really looking forward to the midday session because I think we're going to have very nice discussions there. Just, I wanted to address a couple of things. I think there was a very important point just raised about the lack of information or how to manage. So first, there's, I think, two different aspects, and thinking it from the side of an international standard setting body. So the lack of information of known risks, it is a problem, and that is why we try to build strong systems to have those information in place, not for a specific risk assessment, but as part of the system. That's what I was talking about, disease notification and having that information available. But then there is when there is no information because it's a new hazard or it's a new threat, and that is really the cases of emerging diseases that Sophie was referring. And it is a challenge, and the OIE does have a mechanism by which members can also notify and share information of emerging diseases or other relevant cases of animal health information. And based on that, according to the case, we have reacted differently. And for example, last year, throughout the COVID-19 crisis, that it was so uncertain that it was not even clear what was the impact on animals, on animal trades, what it had in the disease. So, for example, there we did took a risk analysis approach as an international organization, and we did conduct several assessment constantly as information was coming on, and reviewing those along the process. And there were several, let's say, risk analysis-based guidance shared with members, like, risk of COVID-19 and working with wildlife, or working with livestock or at some point for fur industry, because that was identified as a risk pathway. So that is just to raise the point that it's also a big challenge for international standard setting bodies to be able to process that uncertainty and try to produce guidance quickly enough.
Okay. Francisco, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to jump in because we've missed, our slot's end. I was supposed to pass the floor back to Gregory MacDonald because there are other sessions scheduled. So a huge thank you to all the speakers for your interventions, and over to you, Gregory, and thank you to the participants for really engaging and for the great questions, and apologize that we're a little bit late.
Thank you very much, Marilyn, for that, and for all the speakers in this first roundtable for the discussions and the insights on existing international guidance and tools that can assist countries in their risk assessment activities. Before we move on, I will remind participants we can continue to have an opportunity to discuss these issues informally with the speakers starting at 1 p.m. So after the morning session wraps up here today. So with that, I will now move on to our second roundtable on risk assessment, where members will share their experiences in this area. I'll invite the moderator and speakers, Ms. Lucy Namu, Ms. Anastasia Avezu, Dr. Berdahl, Ms. Alice Neely, Dr. Zhang, and Dr. Zuin to turn on their cameras for this roundtable discussion and the Q&A session that follows. Lucy Namu, who is a senior principal analytical chemist at the Kenyan Plant Health Inspectorate Service, will moderate the discussions. Ms. Namu has over 25 years of experience as a biochemist, having worked in the area of laboratory analytical services and accreditation as a food safety expert, and is currently working in the Trade and Standards Office. Ms. Namu, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and we welcome our speakers today. In this roundtable, we wish to explore and discuss members' perspectives and experiences related to risk assessment, including elements such as hazard identification, hazard characterization, exposure assessment, consequence assessment, and risk characterization, and related issues concerning the implementation of the relevant provisions of the SPS agreement. We will also share experiences related to building capacity and tools currently available to help countries strengthen their technical capacities in risk assessment. We have a round of 5 speakers who we are welcoming. I wish to introduce the speakers, starting with Ms. Allison, who previously was not involved in the first round. Ms. Allison has been Assistant Director with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Plant Pest Risk Analysis Unit, which was formerly called the Plant Epidemiology and Risk Analysis Laboratory since 2016. She oversees a diverse portfolio of pathways, spread, and economic analysis dealing with risks associated with exotic plant pests. During her tenure, she has also developed a new method for prioritizing which plant pests should be targeted for early detection surveys, and routinely developing and delivering training materials and presentations on risk analysis for domestic and international audiences. Welcome, Ms. Alison Neely. Dr. Karima Zuini is a veterinarian specialized in the field of animal health and food safety with 23 years experience in the National Office for Food Safety. Dr. Zwin has several functions, including head of animal health and food products, control unit at the provincial level in 1998, in charge of prophylactic action services within the Animal Health Division in 2011, and is now in charge of the risk assessment unit in the areas of animal health and food safety. She has also participated in many national and international committees and projects related to animal health and food safety, such as the Arab Initiative for Development of Food Safety and Trade Facilitation, and is currently a member of the Scientific Committee of Global Food Regulatory Science Society. Welcome, Dr. Karima. Dr. Knut Bredel is a senior Science and Technology Advisor at the Ministry of Agriculture and Food in Norway. He works with food policy in multilateral organizations such as WTO and FAO, WHO in relation to the EU. He is responsible for the interministerial coordination of national food policy, as well as WTO SPS activity. Before that, he was a research professor at the National Veterinary Institute in Norway and dedicated to risk assessment as member of the Norwegian Scientific Committee in Food. Welcome, Dr. Knut. Dr. Liu Xiang is the head of Risk Assessment Division 2.
The interpreters apologize, but there is a lot of interference on the speaker's microphone due to shuffling papers, and we will not be able to continue. Thank you.
Dr. Liu Xiang is the head, Dr. Liu Xiang is the head of the Risk Assessment Division at the China National Center for Food Safety Risk Assessment. Dr. Liu Xiang initiated his professional interest in food chemical detection and risk assessment in 2003. He is the Deputy Secretary General of China National Expert Committee for Food Safety Risk Assessment, currently responsible for managing assessment of food chemicals. And finally, Ms. Anastasia Alvizu is the Deputy Head of Unit in the Farm to Fork Strategy, formerly the Food Chain Science and Stakeholder Relations Unit D1 at the European Commission, Directorate General of Health and Food Safety since 2018. From 2012 to 2018, she was mainly dealing with Regulation EC 178, which is the General Food Law. In the Food Information and Composition, she has studied law at the University of Athens, Greece, and has obtained a Master of Law at University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. We welcome our speakers. Maybe in the first round, you've heard from the OIE and Codex and other speakers in the first round.
Again, the interpreters apologize, but the interpretation will be suspended while there's shuffling papers on the microphone. It's impossible to hear the speaker.
We have heard from the OIE and Codex and other speakers in the first round this morning on the existing international standards and tools to help countries in the risk assessment activities. Maybe coming to you now, Alison Neely, how do you use international science standards or guidance in your risk assessment? Do you use international standards at all as a basis of your own processes? Maybe at what stage are they considered and how are they used? Welcome, Alison Neely.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. So the U.S. does use the IPPC standards, so I'll refer to them as ISPMs, International Standards for Phytosanitary Measures. And so they are integral to the work that we do and really form the basis for how the U.S. and I know our trading partners conduct plant pest risk analysis. And they're really used throughout all parts of our work. And so just to give you a couple of specific examples,
ISPM2, which is the framework for pest risk analysis, that describes the framework for how pest risk analysis should be used in trade, and it describes each aspect of PRA. So for risk assessment, it provides the framework for how countries should characterize risk, which includes evaluating the pest likelihood of entry, its establishment, its spread, and its economic importance. And these are just really foundational principles that we in the United States use not only for the risk assessments we do for imports, but also the ones that we do in our domestic decision making. ISPM 11 and 26, those are standards that are related to how you do pest risk analysis. And so they really provide some details and describe the different stages that countries should use when conducting pest risk analysis, starting with determining whether an organism even meets the agreed upon definition for what we call a quarantine pest, which is just the term that we use for exotic pests that have the potential to cause harm, and therefore are justified having phytosanitary measures against them. So it starts off describing how we can even determine whether something meets that definition, and then based on that, how to go about assessing risk, and then based on the outcome of the risk assessment, whether how to go about selecting risk management options. And the standards are very flexible in terms of giving countries a lot of leeway in how to do the assessment, but it does lay out what kinds of things should be considered. And so we have used that standard especially ISPM 11, quite a bit in determining our own guidance for how we do import PRAs. So it was basically the foundational document for our risk assessment guidelines. And I know other countries, other of our trading partners, it's the same. And then the other standard that we use quite a lot, or that I use quite a lot in my work, is ISPM 5, which is the glossary. And I think this has been a really important standard in just helping countries make sure that we understand and are using terms in the same way. So in risk assessment, there's terms like introduction and establishment, host range, even economic impacts that actually have maybe different meanings to different people. And by having this glossary, it makes sure that countries are understanding these terms in the same way. And that obviously helps with communication with trading partners, but it helps a lot with communication within our own agency. There are also quite a few standards based on that provide guidance for phytosanitary measures that are very relevant for risk management. I won't talk a lot about those, but obviously ISPM 15 is maybe the most famous one. That one provides solutions for how to remove pests from solid wood packing material. The second part of your question was, do we use international risk assessments as a basis for our processes? And to my knowledge, the U.S. does not or has not used international risk assessments. Excuse me. In fact, I'm not aware of any international risk assessments for plant pests. There may be some, but I'm not aware of them. But I think there's a few reasons for this. First of all, every country, as we know, has the sovereign right to determine its own acceptable level of risk. And there's just a lot of judgments that go into plant pest risk assessment in terms of selecting and evaluating criteria. And so countries are very likely to weigh things very differently. And then second of all, especially in the plant pest world, risk is going to vary a lot by country and region. So the climate and the environmental conditions, based on that, there'll be different hosts and plants and just very different vulnerabilities to pest threats. Environmental species will obviously be very different. Agriculture and production and management systems are very different, as are the industries and trade patterns. The suite of pests already present are very different. So the threats themselves will vary widely. And even if there was an agreement among countries on what criteria are important, the assessment or evaluation of that criteria and that risk will be very different by country and region. And then finally, from my experience, the broader the scope of the assessment, the more resources and time they take. And on the other hand, pest plant pest threats are very dynamic. And so if it takes a long time to complete an assessment, it can almost be outdated before we finish it. So I think more important in our world than international plant pest risk assessments are really having an investment in making more available resources to conduct them, and more focus on sharing information. If countries were more transparent and shared information, this allows for more accurate and robust evaluations of risk and more speedy evaluations, and then ensures that our phytosanitary regulations are based on the best available evidence. So that's what I would focus on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Alison Neely. Maybe now, Dr. Knut, to you, hearing from what we've heard, how does what you have heard compared to Norway's approach? You know, Norway is a different geographical location. How do these approaches differ from how Norway approaches risk assessment? And do you use international standards and rely on international risk assessment? Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. And thanks to Alison for the overview of the situation in the United States. There are, of course, similarities to the United States. Norway is a small country with a very open economy, and we benefit heavily from strong multilateral institutions such as WTO.
The interpreters apologize once again, but the signal quality does not allow us to continue.
Actually, the primary foreign policy interest of Norway is to maintain strong multilateral system. Of course, Alison mentioned the issue of relevance of risk assessment from other regions, and Norway tried to use other risk assessments as far as possible. But of course, there are differences, as was mentioned, in exposure and in habits and environment, etc. So as far as possible, we try to use the local standards and risk assessments. So in Norway, we have the Norwegian Scientific Committee for Food and Environment, and they use this as all the international standards for risk assessments, Codex, EPO, that is the regional IPCC organization for Europe, and OEA, but also other relevant standards and methodologies. And we participate very actively, even though we are a small country, in those organizations. And the risk assessments, the specific risk assessments, as mentioned, they are useful as far as they are relevant. And we have a general policy, maybe unlike US, not to duplicate risk assessments as far as possible. So if we can use maybe not the whole risk assessment, but elements of the risk assessment from other bodies, we try to use that. And actually, this is a two-way street, because members can use international and regional assessments, but international bodies such as EPO that I mentioned, for IPCC for Europe, use also risk assessments for members and turn them into European risk assessments. So, of course, the risk assessment from FAO, WHO, scientific mechanism is very trusted and well known, but we try to use risk assessment from other members as far as possible. But of course, it's maybe difficult to find those risk assessments, and we may not know the quality and the independence of the bodies that perform those risk assessments. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Knut. And maybe at this point, we've had some of the challenges, some of the ways in which countries have dealt with risk assessment. And we'd like to welcome participants right now to our poll question, which should be showing up on the screen right now. We welcome participants to take part in the poll question, showing up on the screen, to look at what are the main challenges with risk assessment. Maybe we welcome you to make your choice. It will close in a few 30 seconds. Probably make your assessment And we can then look at the challenges. I think indeed the area of risk assessment has been a challenge to especially developing countries. Please make your submission. We have a lot of participants and we look forward to getting the feedback from this poll, which should be really closing in we have half a minute left maybe. Members can, the participants can take to participate in the poll. Thank you very much for participating. And we look now at what the main highlights and the main responses to the poll questions are. The most are challenges highlighted really are the availability and quality of data, polling at 69%, and others are evaluating uncertainties. Indeed, we heard the question asked, how do you evaluate risk when you do not have adequate information? And other is resource constraints that pulled in also closely third, and harmonizing risk assessment methodologies identified as one of the challenges. So maybe we have a concurrence in terms of availability and quality of data for the risk assessment as the most polled challenge. We go now to our next round of discussions where we highlight the main the questions, and maybe to you, Dr. Liu Xiang, have you experienced similar challenges in your own risk assessment activities, and what has been done to address some of these challenges? Maybe you'd give us a perspective on that. Thank you. Dr. Liu.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think all of this is challenges to risk assessment in various degrees. As for China, we established the food safety risk assessment system according our food safety law of People's Republic of China in 2009. During the past decade, we also faced almost all these challenges in different periods and different situations. When we realized the challenges and the problems we were facing, we tried to find a way to solve it and set up working mechanisms or procedures to deal with the challenge. At present, in my view, as the answer, the main challenges we are facing are the availability and the quality of data, and to evaluate the uncertainty of risk assessment. China actually generates plenty of data related to food safety every year, but this data were obtained by different organizations for different purposes. So therefore, the data obtained by different methods and in different formats. So it's really a challenge on how to use this data sufficiently in our risk assessment activities. To address this issue, we are now establishing an informational platform to promote sharing data among departments. Meanwhile, we have developing several guidelines on data collection and data quality evaluation to promote the harmonization of data collection and use. Another work we are processing is to develop methods for evaluating uncertainty quantitatively. In this area, we have just studied. We are going to apply the guidelines from SPS and EFSA as a beginning. Besides, keeping independence is an important principle of risk assessment. Here, I want to share some measures have been taken in China to resolve this challenge. At the legal level, the food safety law states that risk assessment should be conducted by independent independent organization use the scientific methods and data. At the organization level, after the food safety law took effect, China set up a national expert committee for food safety risk assessment, which composed by independent experts in medical science, agriculture, food, nutrition, etc. At operation level, the experts committee is responsible for organizing the risk assessment project and reviewing risk assessment reports independently. The approved report becomes the final version. So we assure independence of risk assessment by legal and organizational structure. Of course, we won't ignore the communication with the risk manager and other stakeholders. I think we have to hold the balance. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liu. Maybe now over to you, Dr. Karima. Building on what has just been said by our colleague, could you share some perspectives on the main challenges with risk assessment and maybe what steps have been taken in Morocco to address some of these challenges?
Merci beaucoup, Madame Lucie. Effectivement, au Maroc, nous avons bien entendu.
Bien, hemos escuchado una serie de desafíos relativos a la evaluación de riesgo en el ámbito sanitario. Por supuesto, hay una serie de problemas agravados por la globalización del comercio, así como la integración de nuestros sistemas de producción y el sistema agroalimentario, lo cual tiene grandes repercusiones sobre nuestros hábitos alimentarios, los cuales también han cambiado. Todos estos factores hacen que los peligros sean más presentes, por lo cual requerimos datos actualizados a nivel regional, en particular en la región del África, y el trabajo de evaluación sin estos datos es sumamente complejo. Así que, para fortalecer nuestros dispositivos de seguridad sanitaria, nuestras autoridades nacionales a cargo de la inocuidad alimentaria y seguridad sanitaria recientemente han llevado a cabo un ejercicio estratégico para fortalecer sus dispositivos operacionales. Han creado una entidad It's separate from the risk management entities. In accordance with international good practices, the goal is to make sure that the risk assessment process is at the heart of our area of intervention, as well as strengthening our decision-making system in order to make decision-making, particularly when it comes to applying SPS measures, and to make sure that these are always science-based, dictated by our scientific expertise. Also to formalize the deployment of the risk assessment processes and make sure that they are in agreement with international standards, as well as respecting our code of ethics, particularly objectivity and transparency, as well as managing conflicts of interest. It's also important, given this lack of data, to strengthen our monitoring systems as well as our risk communications system in order to have information from the ground to be able to spot priority risks well in advance, which can put at risk our plant, animal, and human health, and to have the necessary expertise to analyze the data and to guide decision-making, particularly to make sure that we manage the risks well in advance. There are a number of ministries in charge. We've also established regional cooperation mechanisms, particularly with international bodies in charge of this area, in order to strengthen our competencies and to make sure that we follow best practices in our assessment process, which is, again, a major exercise for us and an essential tool in our health security system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Karima. if you'd like to share the slide that you have proposed, but maybe coming on to our next question to Alison Mealy. In your experience, are the challenges different in the context of plant pest risk analysis? Maybe you'd like to share this with us. Thank you.
Sure, and I don't know that the challenges themselves are very different. I think for me, much like how everyone's speaking, the biggest challenge is uncertainty. What I think might be a little bit different is the scale of uncertainty that we face in the plant health world. So, for example, there are literally thousands of potential hosts and plant resources that countries want to protect. So, as opposed to humans where there's just one host, in the plant world, there are literally thousands, and those hosts can occur in many different kinds of systems, from the natural environment to agricultural systems, and those can be cultivated very differently. And so we have so many things to worry about protecting, but then on top of that, there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of potential plant pest threats that come from very different kinds of organisms, from insects to bacteria to fungi to mollusks, nematodes, viruses, viroids. We've talked a lot about emerging diseases, and of course in the plant health world, that is also one of the things that we face. In many cases, we don't know what the threats will be in the natural environment. They're kept in check by natural enemies. But once they get introduced to a new area, they can cause so many more impacts. So even when we can identify the threats, we often don't have, most of the time, we do not have good information on where a particular pest or disease is distributed, on its prevalence or its biology. And then countries themselves may not even be fully aware of what they have and what they don't have. Additionally, you can imagine that because insects can fly on their own, as the things that you worry, the other disciplines worry about as well, the risk itself is very dynamic, since pests spread and reproduce. And so because there are so many hosts and so many different diseases and pests to worry about, that the scale of that is really difficult. And then on top of that, we have so many changes that everybody has in trade patterns, but because there's so many different hosts, that impacts what we're able to know about and then evaluate. So in the United States, for example, we receive lots of market access requests for commodities that we as a country don't cultivate, and so we're not as familiar with what the threats may be, but those commodities may bring many pests with them that can attack plant resources that we do have here. So I think all of that the scale of the uncertainty makes it very difficult in our world. And because there's so much uncertainty, it's very difficult to identify and prioritize which pests to focus on. But at the same time, we can't be precautionary, not only because we know that our phytosanitary measures have to be based on evidence to be justified, but also just because there's simply not enough resources to research and worry about every potential pest threat or prevent every possible establishment. So that, I think the scale is what I would say is maybe a little different.
Thank you very much, Alison. And I think you've addressed some of the questions I see in the question box coming up, and some of them really talking to the speediness, the speed at which risk assessment, especially with regards to plant pest risk analysis, relates, the actual uncertainty and the dynamics. But maybe with regards to a specific one I see, what aspects could be taken into account to reduce the time lag in pest risk analysis? Maybe you would like to comment on that before we move to the next.
So I mentioned this earlier, but I think the thing that makes the biggest difference is sharing of information. So the exporting country for sure has the most information on what pests and diseases are associated with the commodity that they're wanting to export. but we can be hesitant to share, to be completely open and transparent with our trading partners sometimes. But the more information sharing that happens, the more that process can be sped up and facilitated. So to me, I think the most important thing is just transparently and openly sharing all of the information that we have.
Thank you very much. And now maybe we move on to you, Ms. Anastasia Albizu. How does what you have heard said, in particular with regards to the quality and the reliability of data, relate to some of the challenges in risk assessment in the EU? And in particular, what is the new EU legal framework on risk assessment? Maybe you'd like to share some of your perspectives from the EU. Thank you, Ms. Anastasia.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be amongst all these distinguished speakers. I had prepared a slide, if maybe can be shared on the screen. And indeed, the main challenge that we saw is also, we move to the next point. Yes, that's it. The main challenge that we saw also in the poll was about reliability and availability of scientific data. This is a challenge that we also encountered and we are facing also in the EU. If I may, in the EU, we have a legislative framework since 2002, the foundation or a food law, which embeds the risk analysis principle in all EU decision-making in the food chain, a science-based approach across the board. And which also establishes, centralizes, if you like, the risk assessment at EU level through a dedicated body, the European Food Safety Authority, an independent body. So we have a clear separation, risk assessment, risk management. And this has been our framework since 2002. Overall, it works well. It's solid. However, we carried out in 2018 an evaluation to see, is our system solid enough? Does it perform well? Does it meet current trends? What are the challenges? And what emerged, the improvements that emerged were a perceived lack of transparency in the risk assessment. And there was a concern from civil society that studies which underpin EFSA's risk assessment are not robust enough, or there are studies that perhaps have negative results and are hidden. They're not really available. The full picture is not properly assessed. These were the concerns. So there was a call, which also prompted by, there was also a European Citizens Initiative signed by more than 1 million European citizens, calling for additional measures to provide these guarantees that risk assessment is solid, is based on quality data, is based on studies that are robust, and that there is full transparency on the risk assessment. At the same time, another finding we had was resources and how to ensure that EFSA, our EU risk assessment body, is supported by the national risk assessment body. This, in order to address these challenges, there was a new targeted amendment of our legislative framework, which just entered into application this March. So we are in the early days of the application. And if I may, it is basically structured in 3 main strands. The first one, how to ensure the quality and reliability of studies. There are a set of measures that are basically taken at pre-submission phase, and I'm talking more about the authorization dossiers, where there we have intense risk analysis principle. And here there is a possibility, of course, for pre-submission advice, which was not possible before, so that the applicants know what is expected from them and how to meet the legal requirements. And a second measure is that when the commission, they just go to laboratories to commission studies
to support the future applications, that they also inform EFSA. So EFSA will have a database of all the studies that are being performed at pre-submission phase, so that it provides guarantees to the public that it has a full overview of the studies that are taking place in relation with a specific application. These measures alone do not add much. There is a new measure which enhances transparency of the EU risk assessment. For the very first time, we will have full public disclosure of all the studies that support applications early on in the risk assessment process, not after the opinion of the European Food Safety Authority, but as soon as the dossier is being submitted, available for public scrutiny, with the exception of duly justified confidential data. This public disclosure alone also is not enough. We needed to make sure that EFSA has access to the widest evidence base possible. So not only these are made public, but they're also being subject to public consultation to see if there is any other study out there that is pertinent for the assessment that EFSA will be carrying. So at the very end, EFSA can develop a risk assessment opinion, can adopt its risk assessment opinion, scientific opinion based on the widest evidence base possible. This also ensures an adequate and timely engagement of stakeholders. This was one of the challenges that we saw before in the poll. How to address now resources? This is also linked with the capacity building aspect. This new regulation offers the possibility of partnerships. The partnerships between our European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, and the national scientific organizations in the EU member states to create precisely a culture of a EU risk assessment culture, if you like. So we need to ensure a high level engagement from our member states. And how to do that? There is a possibility for the national scientific organizations to prepare scientific opinions to be reviewed by EFSA, peer-reviewed by EFSA later on. That brings together the national risk assessment bodies, organizations with EFSA, precisely to be more robust, to be all together, and to share common values, but also each other's, to feel responsible for each other's success. Where we see such schemes, such partnerships to take place are more in areas where the national scientific organizations have experience, like in the areas of pesticides or novel foods. Thank you very much for this point, and back the floor to you.
Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you. And we've heard very many perspectives from the countries. Maybe at this point, we'd like to just recap on some of the issues, the challenges to do with quality of data, resource constraints, but now more so we want to focus on harmonization. And at this point, I'd like to welcome the poll question, a poll question from the participants. Kindly, we invite you to take the poll so that we can take a maximum of 2 minutes. The first question is there a need for more international, regional risk assessments? As we've seen, different countries have different approaches, and they do adopt various methodology. And the second is, which mechanism would be helpful? Maybe we could examine those two in the next 1 minute. And we thank you for your participation so that we can review the comments on the risk assessment area. This was also one of the challenges that was identified with regards to harmonization and I believe a uniform way of understanding what the risk assessment criteria would be. So we welcome the poll question results. Yeah, thank you very much. we had indeed 85% responding that there is need for more international risk assessment, 85%, some not necessarily. But with the second question, which mechanism would be helpful? Global Register of Risk Assessment by recognized bodies, polling the highest. I think this is very useful as we go to the next question. And maybe at this point, we'd like to welcome you, Dr. Knut. What the scientific evidence, scientific advice mechanism of the WHO, FAO contributes to the multi-layered system, if you like, at the global, regional, and national level to deal with multitude of new chemical products, biological hazards, and novel techniques in a situation of limited resources. Is there a need, in your opinion, to increase the production of international risk assessments? And further to that, are there gaps where more information, more international risk assessments could be helpful in or useful also in other areas? Maybe Dr. Knut, please.
Thank you, Lucy. I'm sorry for the sound in my last intervention. I hope you can hear me better now without earphones. Good. So I have participated in Codex Commission meetings for the last 10 years or so. And during these, we have had FAO, WHO reports on the scientific advice mechanisms. And member states have intervened on this issue. And this has shown that the funding for the risk assessment at the international level is chronically low, and that has been that for many, many years, actually decades. And this hampers reduce the development of standards in the international bodies, as well as the timely delivery of risk assessment. And it is important to remember that risk assessments are global public goods. So they are free to use for anyone, and the use of risk assessment of a WTO member does not exclude the use of any other member of use of that risk assessment. Rather, it's the opposite. The more trading partners that use the same risk assessment, either through a standard from the three sisters, or in their own risk assessment scheme, the more trust we will have, and the more consensus in the science, in the trade, in the food chain. So, and less conflicts. So we need more funding at the multilateral level. Furthermore, the risk assessments today, the way it stands, is very sectorized. So we are looking at one hazard at the time in a risk assessment. Actually, in Norway, for the last few years, it is not only the competent authority for the food chain, but also the competent authority for the environment, the agency. They both order risk assessment from the same scientific body that previously were for the food safety, but now it's for food and the environment. And we have seen that this risk assessment becomes better, more relevant, and more useful for risk management at the national level. And we have also heard today about the international initiative with World Health Organization, OIE, and FAO in the One Health area, and so on. And I also would like to say that we have seen the last decade, we have seen extensive modernization of the scientific advice bodies in relation to the food chain, including in Norway and the EU, a lot of restructuring. And this reform, have you heard about the EU just prior to my intervention? And this reform has been of great importance to policy development and the quality of the regulatory process. But even if this in FAO, WHO, the scientific advice system predates Codex, for example. But we have not seen the same modernization, even though it's both the experts and the secretariat are excellent. They're doing a great job. And even 20 years ago, the FAO and WHO commissioned an independent evaluation of the scientific advice system. And they actually concluded that we should have a more unitary and coordinated approach to risk assessment, and in a manner more independent of the organizational structure in international level. And also a common scientific committee. These are very progressive ideas, but actually we have seen them in Norway since that, and we have seen them in the European Union with EFSA. And this recommendation 20 years back in time might even be more useful and relevant today. When it comes to specific gaps, I have a slide, maybe I can get that on the screen. Let's see. And this figure, well, we see parts of it. And this shows, there it is, yes. So it shows 5 or so of the 10 different risk assessment areas in the food chain. So at the top level, we have the United Nations, FAO, WHO in the food risk assessment, and we have the European Union with EFSA in the middle, and the Norwegian Scientific Committee at the bottom. And they all do risk assessment, specific risk assessment on microorganisms. We see at the bottom the 5 different areas: pesticide residues, GMOs, food additives, and natural toxins. And there are other areas as well, not in this figure. In Norway, as I said earlier, we try not to duplicate risk assessment. As far as possible, we try not to duplicate. And we use risk assessment available from the international or EU level as far as they are present. And we see there are also GMO standards from the Three Sisters that are very useful. But at the UN level, we have risk assessment on some regulated products and natural hazards, but in some areas, we do not have a risk assessment. And maybe we should look into this and see if there are emerging areas or maybe emergency areas in some instances that should be, there are gaps. They may be useful to have international risk assessment in other areas. And maybe that would be for GMOs or the new CRISPR technologies or nanotechnologies or other. But that should be continuously assessed. So thank you, Liz. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Knut. Maybe to you now, Karima. What about regional assessments in your region? Are they gaining traction, and do you see a need for more effort in the area? Maybe in 2 minutes we could hear from you.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. In our region, we're reinforcing risk assessment as we just saw relative to the challenges. Today, we need to enhance regional cooperation. Countries share concerns regarding food safety. This kind of program will help better use our skills and our means in order to assess risk. And this can also help have a regional database to enhance assessment and to carry out that risk assessment. And that could also help to harmonize the way we assess risk. I'm involved in different regional projects on risk assessment. We also have the MENA Codex project. We do this with the risk analysis platform, and I welcome these initiatives. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all the different players that have helped to promote these initiatives, which will help harmonize what we do to assess risk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Dr. Knut, back to you, maybe in a minute. Could you go back to the question asked by participants? Do you see the need for a certification mechanism maybe for risk assessment and possibly a global risk assessment register that has been addressed, in terms of databases or in terms of collective risk assessment? Please, 1 minute, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lucy. So the poll was very interesting. We need more international risk assessment, and it was a very strong opinion in favor of some kind of register. And also the certification was rather positive assessed. So I think it's interesting. We should look into these issues. As I said, risk assessments are basically global public goods, can be used by anyone if they're relevant, depending on the environment.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. I know that in some regions there are registers of risk assessment, like for example in EPO for the plant health in Europe, and also EFSA have some register among the European members. So, but they are lacking at the international level. And in Norway we have the scientific body that is independent and work in a transparent way. But outside of Europe, we do not have close collaboration. It's not easy to find risk assessments, to find them, or to assess the quality or independence of those risk assessments. And the SPS agreement, as we know, do not require a member to make their own risk assessment. It should only base their measures on a risk assessment following the international standards relevant. And they are used to certification in the area of laboratories, as for example. And also the business have voluntary third-party accreditation. So we should look into this. I think the cost of risk assessment is great, but the value will be even greater with such a register. Good idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Knut. And indeed, we did get into this, a resounding support for having international risk assessments. Maybe now we want to look closely into the issue of capacity building. Capacity building has been one of the third highest polls as a challenge. And at this point, I'd like to welcome the poll question for participants to take part in capacity building. The specific question: Does your institution participate in activities to strengthen its technical capacities on risk assessment? Maybe we give it half a minute. I think this is a simple yes or no, and maybe my institution may not be involved at this time. We welcome participants in maybe 30 seconds to come to the end of it. Yeah, we'd like to get the results now. We did see a lot, yes, a strong resounding 76% yes, that your institution does get involved in risk assessment. Maybe now capacity in particular, we'd like to welcome you, Dr. Liu. What kind of work does your country do to promote risk assessment capacity? Dr. Liu.
Thank you. Capacity building for risk assessment is one of the most important works we've been devoting to. We are promoting our capacity in several aspects. Firstly, we have been working on the development and application of risk assessment methods and models to strengthen our methodological and technical capabilities. We have developed a series of technical specifications and guidelines to ensure method consistency. These guidelines include not only a very basic one, but also include guidelines on specific risk assessment method, like a TDC method and risk ranking method. Secondly, we built up several national risk assessment databases, including national food consumption data, food hazards surveillance data, and toxicological data. We are still working on promoting the quality, quantity, and quality of the databases. For example, plenty more accurate food consumption data Now we are developing a web-based platform to integrate these methods and the databases. I think this platform will help promoting the use of risk assessment in China. Another important aspect of capacity building is to train risk assessors. On one hand, we strengthen personnel training through international communication, such as the international training programs and academic activities. Before the pandemic of COVID-19, my institution, CIFSA, continued sending staff to study abroad every year. There are more than 50 persons attended short or long-term training or internship at the organizations including EFSA, BFR, Fudan, and GIFSN. On the other hand, we reinforced domestic training. CIFSA conducts national training programs periodically to cultivate local risk assessor. In the future, we will continue to strengthen our capacity building in various ways. We also hope to enhance the collaboration with food agents around the world on the methodology and personnel training. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liu, for those insights in capacity building. And I think capacity building are very important for countries, especially developing countries. But one I see in the dialogue question session maybe is when a country has a lack of the data or the capacity to establish risk analysis or risk assessment of certain diseases. What can the country do? What options does the country do? And I think we've heard various tools that exist, various support mechanisms that exist, but maybe you'd like to answer now in our question and answer session. Maybe, again, Dr. Liu, maybe you'd like to take this question. And maybe participants at this point, we welcome you to post in your questions in the chat box. If they are to a specific speaker, kindly indicate to which speaker the question is addressed to. But Dr. Liu, maybe you'd like to take up this question to start with. Thank you.
I think it's very important to have data to conduct risk assessment, especially if you want to get accurate results. But in many occasions, conditions that we always don't have enough data to conduct risk assessment. But actually, we have many methods to deal with these situations, such as we can to conduct a theoretical assessment, just use very not so accurate data, but actually also can give a screen assessment. Of course, there may some uncertainties in this risk assessment report, but actually it also can give some I think advice to the risk manager for decision making, and also we can also use data from the other countries or other papers like this, to enhance our risk assessment results. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. Maybe to the other speakers, if you would like to add on a possible suggestion to some of the questions in the poll box, a lot to do with capacity and lack thereof, what can be done. Can Codex standards or national standards indeed be used and adopted by the country that needs the risk assessment? We have 12 minutes now. Maybe we'd like to hear from you, the other speakers. Maybe Anastasia, you'd like to take the floor now, maybe in 1 minute. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think there was also some interesting questions posted. I think it's maybe a challenge. What I think we'll be seeing very much in the future is the availability of data. A lot of data out there, but we may need also to structure those data for scientific assessment. So the other challenge we face is how to ensure common standard data formats, so that it would facilitate this cross-fertilization, if you like, across different member states, and have solid risk assessments across the world. I think that's an interesting development. Just to mention as well that the new EU regulation provides for that possibility to develop standard data formats, and that is something that we should be, when we will do it, to keep an eye to the international community to make sure there is a broader acceptance, so we follow well-established practices and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. What about you? What are your opinions and perspectives of Karima in this area of capacities and the need for data and databases, indeed, to support risk assessment? Dr. Karima.
Oui, merci, Madame Lucie.
Thank you. Yes, I said that this database issue could be developed through regional programs to make up for the lack of data. And all this can be done by making an effort on priority data for countries that share the same health concerns. And when work is done in one country through regional cooperation, other countries can benefit from risk assessments conducted in the other countries. And regarding transparency, I think this too should be worked on a regional basis.
Thank you very much, Karima. And I think you addressed the issue of the need for international standards to draw on a more wider variety of data and needs from countries and improving this situation. Maybe to you, Dr. Knut, the funding situation, I think a lot of the comments has been on capacity and limited resource constraints. The funding situation in international scientific advice has been chronically low in recent years. Important ongoing work is put in danger, and important new work is postponed. How can this situation be improved? And based on your experience, what are some of the areas that have evolved to address this? I think we heard some of it from Tom Highland earlier, but maybe your perspective, please, Dr. Knut.
Thank you, Lucy. Well, this is a very difficult question. As I said, this has been a problem for decades with the funding of scientific advice. In most international organizations, and of course, in case of the FAO and WHO, they have very limited budgets. So the last decades, a lot of the risk assessment has been able due to members contributing voluntary funding or expertise to the secretariat. I participated some years ago in an FAO open-ended working group to look into this problem with the funding situation. And of course, this is a joint FAO-WHO enterprise, and especially WHO, but also FAO. They're neutral status, and they have to keep special interest group and a hand's length. Of course, different kinds of funds has been looked into to have funds where private sector may contribute to risk assessments without any strings attached, even without knowing what you are funding. There are some models been trying out. So I think both the international organization and also the members have to look into the basic funding of this multilateral organization to increase the funding, especially for food safety as the area we are dealing with now and risk assessment. But it's a very difficult question, but it's a very important one. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Knut. And maybe to you, Alison Neely, I think maybe you could share some capacity building experiences in the area of plant health and strengthening technical capacity and risk assessment, and maybe look at how this has worked in your experience. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Of course, I think that it's a very important area. In the U.S., we have moved to doing some more online training courses, which are available in English, Spanish, and French, as well as Urdu. And you can find those on spscourses.com. I can post that link. There's quite a few modules there on pest surveillance, pest ID systems, in addition to the SPS agreement, pest risk assessment, pest risk management, communication. And so we've moved to doing sort of a hybrid approach where we have these online modules that then will often follow up with in-person training, and have found that to be very useful. We have conducted courses on plant health systems analysis for people from developing countries to come and learn how, at least in the U.S., that we've set up our regulatory system, which includes training on risk assessment, and give in-person workshops. I think some of the challenges that we have are that it's hard to learn everything from a one-time workshop, and we understand that. And so working towards solutions where we can have more ongoing building. I mean, those are things that I think that in the U.S. we know exist, that's a challenge, but working it in with our own work is, it's definitely a challenge. So, but those are some of the things that we do.
Thank you very much, Alison, for this experience. And maybe now participants are welcome to raise questions. We also remind you that we have an opportunity that will continue after this roundtable. You have an opportunity to discuss openly and pose questions to the speakers, various speakers. They will still be available to answer your questions. And this will be at 1 o'clock, but maybe before we close, I see we have 4 minutes left, maybe half a minute each. In your closing remarks, would you like to address specific issues relating to methodologies and needs for developing countries and areas to build synergies in this that we have seen in some of the areas? Maybe I invite each one of you to make intervention of half a minute before we close, starting with you, Dr. Knut.
Thank you. Thank you. So, one of the priorities for Norway is to work through the multilateral organizations like FAO and WHO and so on. And also the STDF, as you know, works together with the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, but it's in capacity building. Of course, we also have Norwegian programs in food safety are parts of a bigger picture. So, but especially to acquire data from different regions and developing countries is very important. Also for the international risk assessment. So more efforts should be carried out in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Knut. Maybe to you, Anastasia, you'd like to share some perspective on how to improve in these issues. Anastasia?
How to do? Sorry, I didn't catch the last part.
Share some perspectives on how the EU has been involved in improving risk assessment capacities, especially with regard to comments posed by developing countries in this area. Thank you.
I think I would like more to emphasize what I said before on the capacity building. It was more important in the EU to address the operational sustainability of the European Food Safety Authority, to make sure that we had the scientific capacity to continue having, to meet the standard of excellence in our scientific opinions. And here is the partnership that we want to build with the national risk scientific organizations in our EU member states. This is an untapped, perhaps, the potential that could create this EU risk assessment culture. So that's where we are aiming at, and we will try to build it in the next few years. So this is our main capacity building, let's say, in the area of risk assessment and major challenge for the years to come.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. Maybe to you, Alison, and I think the question that begs in the chat Q&A is, what is a sufficient period for conducting risk assessment, timelines of risk assessment, I think, in these challenges of capacity? Maybe, Alison, share your perspective.
I think this is the number one question that I'm always asked, and I'm going to give you the most unsatisfactory answer possible, which is that it honestly really just depends on the situation. So as I mentioned, that the risks are so diverse and dependent, and so it really depends on the commodity. It depends on how much information we're given by the exporting country. It depends on the priorities that we have in place. So I cannot give an answer at all to this very question that gets asked the most, and it just really depends.
Thank you, Alison. Indeed, the elephant in the room. How long, right? We invite you, Dr. Liu. Maybe your perspective on this issue. Maybe you'd like to give us a question on the answer to how long.
Yes. You mean the expose data?
Yes. The length of time to complete a risk assessment. What is the reasonable length of time to do so, and when can it be said it is appropriate? Dr. Liu.
Sorry, pardon?
There have been comments in the chat box raised on the adequacy, the length of time that it should take to undertake a risk assessment. In your opinion and your experience, what is the length of time that would be appropriate? Say, this is the appropriate length of time and for a risk assessment to be completed. Thank you.
I think it's a lack of time. I didn't see the question here.
Okay, it is a difficult one, elephant in the room, indeed. But maybe you could give us your perspective as Dr. Karima. Maybe you'd like to attempt and give us what your experience has been with it.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Madame Lucie.
Yes, thank you very much. Well.
Le processus d'évaluation du risque, c'est une étape cruciale dans tout le processus d'analyse du risque, et ça doit vraiment retenir notre attention, nous les acteurs qui œuvrons dans le domaine de la sécurité sanitaire. C'est pour ça qu'aujourd'hui, il faudrait qu'on mette tous les préalables nécessaires pour la bonne exécution de cette étape, notamment
carry out the stage, particularly the human resources that are qualified, as well as all the other inputs that are needed, such as the data, the occurrence and the consumption data. So for that, we need to work together as a region and internationally in order to optimize the risk assessment process. Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you very much indeed. And back to the chairman. Sorry, we have run over time. Welcome, Dr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for facilitating this session. It was very rich discussion. I didn't mean to cut it off, but we have our time limits with Zooms, but that is an invitation for people to stay on and join the informal discussion over lunch. Just a couple of quick announcements before wrapping up. We did recognize there were some technical issues with audio and interpretation at one point. So when the recordings will be posted on the website, we will try to ensure those issues have been remedied. So with that, the session comes to an end. And of course, please go over to the side sessions to continue this rich discussion if you feel so compelled to do so. They will be not recorded and there'll be no interpretation provided, but it will be a good opportunity to continue these informal exchanges. And just a reminder, you will have received an email with the links to the side sessions that were sent out earlier today. So with that, I do want to thank all the participants again for participating this morning, and I wish you a good break, and we will see everyone back here in a couple of hours. Thank you.